Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, Labour has thrown its weight behind a so-called soft Brexit, arguing for the UK to stay in the single market and the customs union during any transition period, which could last years. Pro-European backbenchers in the party have welcomed the move, including the former shadow business secretary, who told Sky News he thinks the policy shift will garner cross-party support.
I think certainly the arithmetic is quite finely balanced in the House of Commons now on maintaining membership of the single market and the customs union, at least during the transition period. And I think if Conservative members of Parliament, act in the national interest, I could certainly see a situation where potentially we can win votes on this kind of issue when the House of Commons returns in September.
Our political correspondent Tamara Cohen has the latest.
Well, this is really big shift because during the election campaign, Labour had a very fudged position on the EU, trying to keep their Leave and Remain supporters happy. And then after the election, Jeremy Corbyn said that Britain would leave the single market because that was basically the same as staying in the EU. Now we have a very different story from Sir Keir Starmer, who you can see with the party leader there. He says this is now the party's position. It's been signed off by the party leadership. And writing in The Observer, he says a Labour government would want to stay in the single market and the customs union at least for the next few years during a transition period, which they think could last up to 4 years and maybe even beyond that if the EU, he says, will make concessions on immigration. So a very different position, and one which he hopes will put an end to the mixed messages, because it's certainly true that we've seen some senior Labour figures struggling to explain the party's position in recent weeks. Now, I understand it follows some intense discussion within the party over the last couple of weeks, and it's a position they hope will put pressure on the Conservatives as the MPs head back to Parliament in a week or so's time, because this is a different position from the one the Conservatives are advocating, which is for Britain to leave the customs union as soon as we can in March 2019. So the party are now united on that position. The real coup, as Chuka Umunna was setting out there, would be if they could get any Conservatives on side, Conservatives perhaps sceptical about Theresa May's approach. They'll need to talk to them over the next couple of weeks. But certainly, even if the Conservatives don't vote with Labour, as he was suggesting there, it would certainly put them in a position to force concessions from Theresa May. So as David Davis heads to Brussels tomorrow for the next round of talks, that may well be on his mind.
Well, let's bring you more now on Labour's policy shift today in favour of the UK remaining in the single market and the customs union during a transitional period following Brexit. Well, in the past few minutes, we've heard from the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. This is what he had to say.
This is a transition arrangement that he's suggesting. It's the government that has confusion. It restarts the negotiations tomorrow, and it seems to me that they're in danger of wandering into a cliff-edge Brexit. Ours is protect jobs and protect working conditions in the transition.
Do you accept that free movement of people and the payments to the EU will then continue beyond Brexit?
Well, obviously we've got to work out what the arrangements are during the transition period and make sure we reach agreement on that. But quite clearly the priority has to be protecting jobs and also understanding the needs of EU nationals that are living here. We've already said that we would, as a Labour government, guarantee their rights to remain in Britain, and also recognise that many of our public services wouldn't be able to operate without EU nationals working in them.
How long do you envisage a transition arrangement going on for?
I don't know what the length of it will be. I think we should simply say as long as is necessary, and but make it time limited. I hear the government's thinking in terms of 2 years, but we're not putting a time limit on it. What we want to say is we need to reach an arrangement which protects the long-term trading relationship between Britain and Europe and jobs in this country, because all the manufacturing industries in Britain rely on a supply chain all across Europe.
Finally, could that mean staying in the customs union beyond the transition arrangement?
Cannot answer that at this stage. What it means is we have to have an effective tariff-free trade arrangement with Europe, and we have to look at trading arrangements with the rest of the world. But the priority has to be half of our trade is with Europe. We've got to protect those jobs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't mean to hit your phone there.
Well, back in the UK, Labour has thrown its weight behind a so-called soft Brexit, arguing for the country to stay in the single market and the customs union during any transition period, which could last years. Well, the party says it wants to avoid the cliff edge of a hard Brexit, which could harm the economy. Our political correspondent, Darren McCaffrey, reports.
Britain's journey to leave the European Union has already set sail. But how we get there and what the final destination looks like, well, it appears increasingly up for grabs. Labour now claim that the new course they have set will mean a smooth transition out of Europe's political union while staying tied to an economic one. The shadow Brexit secretary, writing in the Observer newspaper, has said there is now near consensus that a transitional period is an economic and political necessity. Labour would seek a transitional deal that maintains the same basic terms that we currently enjoy with the EU. That means we would seek to remain in a customs union with the EU and within the single market during this period. It means we would abide by the common rules of both.
This is a transition arrangement that he's suggesting. It's the government that has confusion. It restarts the negotiations tomorrow, and it seems to me that they're in danger of wandering into a cliff edge Brexit. Ours is protect jobs and protect working conditions in the transition.
But for the Labour leadership, it will mean accepting years of handing money back to Brussels, the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and the free movement of people. And for some, that is nothing short of betrayal.
There's something really irresponsible about coming out with a policy that is all about trying to score points and not do what's right for Britain. Staying in the customs union while leaving the EU would be the worst of all worlds. It would mean that the EU gets to dictate our trade policy without us having any say.
Labour's dramatic policy shift today does pose big problems for the government's overall Brexit strategy, because in that place, in the Commons, who get to vote on the final deal, there may well now be a majority in favour of staying inside the single market and the customs union during that transition period. Even though, of course, that is not the negotiating position of Theresa May and the UK government with Brussels.
The arithmetic is quite finely balanced in the House of Commons now on maintaining membership of the single market and the customs union, at least during the transition period. And I think if Conservative members of Parliament, act in the national interest, I could certainly see a situation where potentially we can win votes on this kind of issue when the House of Commons returns in September.
Tomorrow, David Davis yet again travels to Brussels to resume Brexit talks, demanding that the EU shows greater flexibility, determined Britain will not change course. But given the uncertain waters British politics finds itself in, he and the government may have little choice. Darren McCaffrey, Sky News, Westminster.
So how will Labour's policy change go down with its voters in the Brexit-supporting heartland of North East England? Gerard Tubb reports now from Wallsend in Tyne Wear.
There was a time when Tyneside was simply Labour, but not anymore. Brexit cuts across party lines, and reaction to Labour's new Brexit policy depends where on the Tyne you go.
Built at a cost of £2 million, this is the first cruiser launched on the Tyne this year.
Go downriver and back long enough, and Wallsend was a centre of heavy industry. But the last ship built here has long gone. Globalisation has largely left Wallsend behind. For many families, it feels like things were better in the past. In the Coronation Social Club, support for Labour's new stance on Europe is scarce.
It's a working environment. Everybody's working. We've all subsidised other countries. Money guns left, right and centre. It never stops here. Foreign aid guns all over. Foreign aid. What about our country, our people?
So you don't want to stay in the single market?
No.
You want hard Brexit?
Yep. Sorry, but I do.
So you'd rather Labour just said, no, out is out?
Out is out. Stop, yeah.
Just upriver, it feels like a different world where Jeremy Corbyn can attract thousands to a general election rally. There's more opportunity here, and voters who welcome Labour's new policy of 1 foot in.
It's nice to see someone suggesting something sane.
If Labour had that policy at the next election, would you be likely to vote for them?
Most likely.
I would like to know more about it, but if the people who know about these things that would be a viable thing to do, yes, I would think that would be a good thing.
Tyneside is as split on Brexit as anywhere. Being a Labour voter isn't as simple as it used to be. Gerard Tubbs, Sky News, Wallsend.
Well, more now on Labour's dramatic shift on Brexit, saying it now backs continued UK membership of the EU single market and the customs union during a Brexit transition period. Let's talk to Rupert Myers. He's the political correspondent at GQ. Rupert, good afternoon. It's been called a dramatic shift, a game changer. What do you think?
Well, I think it's being overestimated in scope by a lot of people. A lot of people are very excited at the prospect of there being either a second referendum on Brexit or no Brexit at all, clambering to grasp this change in tone from the Labour Party. But actually, when you look at the detail, what they're really just saying is that there needs to be a longer period of transition in which we retain the single market and the customs union and accept as the price for that freedom of movement, just to prevent that cliff edge that might happen if we leave very suddenly. You've got to remember that the people who wrote the Article 50 never thought it would be used like this. They thought it would be used if, for example, a dictator took hold in a European country. It just doesn't give a long enough period, 2 years, Labour Party people say, for the government to put in place a deal that will stop our economy from juddering after we leave the EU. So it's not a revolution, it's an evolution.
What do you think businesses are going to say about this? Do you think they're going to look at this and say, yeah, this looks a better deal than what we can get with what the government is currently proposing?
Well, the danger with what the government is proposing is that at the moment there's a cliff edge when we leave the single market and the customs union. There's only 2 months before we leave. Our IT system to deal with customs provisions is supposed to be up and running. We know how government IT systems work. I think a lot of people will be more concerned that we keep frictionless, seamless trade with the EU than simply quit for the sake of it before we've got those post-Brexit arrangements in place, particularly in places like the Irish border, where a sudden hard border, it must be something we avoid at all costs.
But if we leave this, in essence, you're saying it's prolonging the negotiations. But if we leave it open-ended, I mean, do you think after that, after March 2019, we have to say, if we do adopt what Labour is saying here, that they have to say, OK, we're going to prolong this, stay in the customs union and the single market, but we have to have a time period when that will end?
And Sir Keir Starmer has said that on behalf of the Labour Party. He's made it quite clear that this period will go on for as much time as necessary, but no longer. Obviously, at the moment, we have no idea what the Brexit deal will look like because they're still arguing about the divorce, let alone this new relationship. So personally, I think that there's a lot to be said for lengthening out the period of this process to make sure it goes as smoothly as possible. But I'd be in no doubt, Labour have not come out today and said that they want to halt Brexit, despite the fact that the majority of Labour supporters now are against it, and growing polls suggest that there's a growing support for a second referendum. But the Labour Party aren't saying that. They're just saying there needs to be a longer period of transition to prevent economic damage caused by leaving too suddenly and too abruptly for business.
OK, Rupert, I just want to ask you, cross-party support. Chuka Umunna came onto Sky and said that he thinks it's going to have cross-party support. Do you?
I think it will not take a great number of Conservative rebels for this to be an amendment that would be passed through Parliament. I think there will be support for it because I think when the government starts talking to business, and a lot of your viewers will be small, medium-sized business people, and they'll be thinking, hey, no one's consulted me on Brexit and how that's going to affect my business. I think as we hear from business and we hear from people worried about the economic impact, and you've got to remember that the UK economy is already slowing now. It had half the rate of economic growth from the rest of the Eurozone in the second quarter of this year. I think there will be a lot of pressure on Conservative members of Parliament to listen to business and to try and implement a longer transition period. So, yes, I think Chuka Umunna is right. There may be people crossing over from the other side of the aisle on this.
Rupert, thanks a lot. Rupert Myers there from GQ.
For the first time, the Labour Party has committed to keeping the UK in the single market and customs union during any transitional period after Britain leaves the EU. The shadow Brexit secretary, Sir Keir Starmer, says withdrawing from both at once would be too risky. The shift in policy does mean the UK continuing to accept the free movement of people. Our political correspondent Ian Watson has the story.
Labour's leadership have always been clear. They respect the result of the EU referendum, but they've been less clear about what sort of Brexit they want. But now the shadow Brexit secretary and the Labour leader have agreed on a direction of travel. In the transitional period immediately after we leave the EU, our current relationship would basically stay in place. Writing in The Observer, Keir Starmer says that means we would seek to remain in a customs union with the EU and within the single market during this period. It means we'd abide by the common rules of both. Never mind talks between Britain and Brussels. As I understand it, there's been intense negotiations within Labour's ranks to clarify their own position. Well, what does abiding by EU rules actually mean? It would mean, for example, the continuation of free movement of labour, making it difficult to control EU migration. But just how long would Labour's transitional period actually last?
Here the government's thinking in terms of 2 years, but we're not putting a time limit on it. What we want to say is we need to reach an arrangement which protects the long-term trading relationship between Britain and Europe and jobs in this country. And we have to look at trading arrangements with the rest of the world.
Jeremy Corbyn was speaking at the Edinburgh Festival, but behind the scenes in Labour there's been pressure on him to go even further and commit to permanent single market membership.
What people would now like to see, building on this important step forward, is for the Labour Party to commit to single market membership and customs union after the transition period, after the UK has left the European Union.
But some Labour MPs who voted to leave the European Union disagree.
Jeremy is on a journey. Where did he start and what is he saying today? I've not been on a journey. I campaign for us to come out. So I think people can keep the faith with those of us Labour MPs who campaign to come out and to know that we're not doing any ratting or U-turning or anything else.
At the last election, Jeremy Corbyn managed to pull off a delicate balancing act, appealing both to remain and to leave voters. This may be a more difficult feat for him to repeat as he clarifies his position on Brexit. Ian Watson, BBC News.
Now, Labour says it would keep Britain inside the single market and customs union for a transitional period in a dramatic shift in policy. They said the government's plan to take the UK straight out of these arrangements the moment Brexit happens would be highly risky. The party also left open the options of staying inside the customs union and single market for good. Here's Jane Dodge.
That's for you. We may be leaving the EU, but our love affair with Italian ice cream shows no signs of wilting. Business was brisk on Camden High Street in London today. Labour's man in charge of Brexit policy, Keir Starmer, is the local MP here. Today he signalled a radical change in direction. Hard Brexit is out. It's welcome news for 19-year-old Afsha Dalvi, a Labour voter.
Because we're leaving anyways, if we were able to have a soft Brexit and remain, have as many links as we can, I think personally that would be better. I prefer that.
Unlike the current government, Labour says in a transitional period after we leave the EU, it would stay in the single market, stay in the customs union, which would mean free movement of labour would continue, and we could stay in both for the long term if a deal could be reached on immigration.
So is Labour now the party of soft Brexit? It certainly appears that the leadership have done a U-turn. Up until now, Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell have said that there was no chance of staying in the single market. The government's reduced majority has changed that.
Jeremy Corbyn has certainly been in campaign mode. He's spent the last 5 days in Scotland targeting SNP swing seats. He says the government's in danger of wandering into a cliff-edge Brexit, but was short on detail about Labour's alternative.
Well, obviously we've got to work out what the arrangements are during the transition period and make sure we reach agreement on that. But quite clearly the priority has to be protecting jobs and also understanding the needs of EU nationals that are living here. We've already said that we would, as a Labour government, guarantee their rights to remain in Britain, and also recognise that many of our public services wouldn't be able to operate without EU nationals working in them.
Formal Brexit negotiations start tomorrow. In response to Labour's new policy, a government spokesman has said,
"This is a weak attempt to kick the can down the road. Their leader can't say they would end unlimited freedom of movement, they can't decide whether we are leaving the single market, and they have no vision for what Britain should look like outside the EU."
Labour will have to do some twists and turns to stop a hard Brexit. They'll have to persuade pro-Europe Tory MPs to back them, and the clock is ticking. The EU withdrawal bill returns to the Commons at the beginning of next month.
Jane Dodge there. Well, I'm joined now by the Labour MP Heidi Alexander, who's been calling for her party and backing staying in the single market, and the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Vince Cable. Thank you both for coming in. Heidi Alexander, well, you're in some sort of unholy unity here, I don't doubt, with Vince Cable and the Lib Dems, but what's suddenly changed for the leadership?
Well, I think that would have to be a question that you'd put directly to Keir and Jeremy. I'm pleased by what we've heard today, in as much as it's a very necessary statement for us to be staying in the single market and customs union for transition. But whilst I welcome it, I'm not entirely sure it's sufficient. I think a number of the arguments that we've heard Keir make today about the need to avoid a cliff edge Brexit, the need to avoid a deluge of new red tape for businesses, and to give that certainty to businesses as well. I mean, I think those.
But my point of questioning is the sudden Damascus vision, if that it be, from the leadership, and the fact that there's unity here. I mean, Labour leave tweeting today. You know, what we have now in the Labour Party is a united front against one of the most massive mandates in British history.
Well, I don't accept that at all, to be honest. I also think that describing this as some sort of Damascene conversion is probably overstating it. I think a number of weeks ago, Keir Starmer put out a statement that said that he would prefer a transitional arrangement that was on similar terms to what we have at the moment. He has gone further today and said single market and customs union for transition. I think the point I was wanting to make earlier, though, was that those arguments that we make about why it's right for transition, I think those apply as much in 2022 as they would in 2019. And so I think that the Labour Party should be unequivocally arguing to stay in the single market and customs union and not be seeking to delay.
Should be, but you've still got big elements within the party to convince here, haven't you?
Well, I think there is a difference of views within the Labour Party. But if we look at recent polling that has been done of the Labour membership, for example, 4 out of 5 Labour members have said that they would want to stay in the single market and customs union. We've got Labour Party conference coming up in a month's time, and I think it's really important that we have that debate there. Right,
well, Vince Cable, you have an opportunity now to show Heidi Alexander the error of her ways. You tried all this at the general election and the public didn't buy it.
Well, I think we've moved on a long way since the general election. I mean, actually, I find Heidi's personal position very clear and credible, but it isn't at all clear where the Labour Party now is. I mean, what is the destination? Are we talking about leaving the single market and the customs union or staying in? That remains an entirely open question. It isn't clear from this statement whether this represents
trying to stay
the total leadership as opposed to Keir Starmer. What's going to happen to people like Barry Gardiner, the kind of extreme end of the Brexit element in the Labour Party, when their position would imagine become completely impossible and they will have to go. So, you know, a lot of interesting questions have been raised. I'm glad Heidi's reassured, but actually I don't think this takes us very far forward.
But is it realistic, leaving aside the internal difficulties that you say Labour may not have, is it in any way realistic to even think that you can stay in these kind of mechanisms long term or even permanently, as Keir Starmer is clearly suggesting he'd like to do?
Of course we can stay in, and I think there is a fair possibility we will. And we must, because it is in our national interest. And the way to deal with the democratic deficit is to ensure that the public have a vote on the outcome, which is what a lot of increasingly credible Labour people like Sadiq Khan have been urging, as well as my party. And that would be a way of dealing with that particular problem.
But they want out, Heidi Alexander. And I'll come to you, Vince, in a second. The British public want out of all this. We don't want to be part of the superstate. We want out of these mechanisms. We voted for that. You have to respect that.
The British public were sold a pup during the referendum. We were told that there would be an extra £350 million a week for the NHS, which hasn't materialised. We were told that we would be free from the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, which the government have now admitted is not possible. We've been told that there's a golden economic future out there for us, when the reality is that a number of businesses are saying that they are looking at moving their operations overseas. No, I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that there were 16 million people that voted to remain last year. There were 17 million people that voted to leave, and 13 million people who could have voted who didn't. And I think as the reality of Brexit starts to bite, a number of people are saying, is this chaos? Is this cost actually worth it? We have a responsibility as members of Parliament to limit the damage. We've got important legislation that's coming forward in the next few weeks, and I think that that is what the Labour Party is keen to do, is to hold the government to account and to limit the damage that the Conservatives are wanting to do.
But Vince Cable, you go down that pathway that Heidi Alexander's just opened, you'd rerun every single election we've ever had. I mean, you can't simply say that the people were sold a pup, they were misinformed. The people made their decision. You have tested it against their decision in a general election. You lost badly. A couple of minutes ago, you said, well, we need to move on from that. But we don't need to move on from that. You've tried, you've tested, you've failed. It's time to recognise democracy.
The position is changing all the time. This whole issue about hard or soft Brexit, whether we're in the single market, these were never properly debated at the time. There will be a decision point when the government's completed its negotiation, and that will be the point at which to ask the British public again, do they want to charge ahead with Brexit or stay where we are? And, and that is where the democratic issue has got to be properly addressed. But I think the case that Heidi made against the outcome of the referendum was very fair and absolutely spot on.
Right, well, we'll watch this harmony with some interest. We'll have to leave it there. Thanks for coming in.